Ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you so much to Enrique and OTT for inviting me here today. As introduced, I'm Tricia, CEO of IDEAS, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. We operate from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. So, buenas tardes. I'd like to share the story of IDEAS with you. So that's how I'm going to start. I'll share how IDEAS has been able to navigate an extremely complex society in Malaysia and still emerge as an important influential role for policy change. I will then end by reflecting on our experience with some thoughts about what this means about think tanks and their communities more broadly. But to do that, please indulge me. I need to start with the context of the country in which we operate, Malaysia. So Malaysia can be classified as an electoral authoritarian or hybrid regime. There was a session earlier. Up to 2018, we were ruled by the single-party dominant regime of UMNO. And because of the many years of this one-party government, the institutions of party and government are fused into one, where it is assumed that institutions function at the behest of the ruling party. UMNO long practiced patronage politics, resulting in community dependence on politicians for all kinds of public services, welfare, and basic assistance. Malaysia is also a federation of 13 states, but a highly centralized one where the central government controls most policy and fiscal matters. So as a result, states and society at the subnational level have never given much thought to participating in decision-making. We also still have a system of monarchy. We have 9 rulers of 9 states that rotate, believe it or not, to ascend as king every 5 years. While the king is largely ceremonial in nature, the rulers have played an increasingly significant role in influencing matters related to race, religion, and nationhood. Malaysia is a highly multiracial and multi-religious society. We have a majority ethnicity of Malays, about 67%, a large minority of Chinese, that's me, about 20%, and 7% Indians as well as other indigenous minorities. So, in short, there has always been some tension between the Malay and non-Malay communities, especially dating back to the 1930s when citizenship was being negotiated. Our 1957 constitution eventually contained a clause that provides for what's called a special position of the Bumiputra community, translated as the princes of the earth or the sons of the soil, referring to Malay and indigenous communities. So there's a commonly accepted view that there's a social contract agreed upon where there's a trade-off between majority and minority populations of Malaysia, citizenship for the Chinese and Indian migrant communities in exchange for the special position preserved for the majority Bumiputra population. This has seeped into all aspects of public life. There was a new economic policy that was set up in 1971 to ensure that the Bumiputra would enjoy affirmative action privileges across the spectrum, from housing to education and corporate equity. There's been unhappiness, quite naturally, that emerged from among the ethnic minorities, criticizing this as a form of institutionalized racism. There are also separate education and employment tracks. The Chinese go to Chinese language schools, are employed in the private sector, largely dominated by the Chinese. Malays go to Malay language public schools, and the elites go to English language private and international schools. We also have separate language newspapers, so it is quite a divided society. So this was the backdrop within which a think tank like IDEAS was formed in 2010, 14 years ago. At the heart of it, the founders were classical liberals who subscribed to the principles of liberal democracy, i.e. competitive markets, the rule of law, individual liberty, and a limited government. The think tank would speak of things like freedom of expression, freedom of speech, equality before the law, many things that actually ran counter to the dominant political narrative of the day. But how were we going to champion these ideals in a society that still espoused conservative values, believed in a strongman state, and did not actually practice equality before the law? how are we going to situate ourselves in this context of Malaysia's multiple and highly layered society? So first, we took the words out of our founding fathers' mouth. We had a vision that was plucked from the country's first Prime Minister's independence speech to uphold the values of liberty and justice. We launched on his birthday, for example, in February. We invited the family members of this first Prime Minister to join us in this journey. So we disrupted the narrative to say that, in fact, we are very much Malaysian. So this sort of answers the question of representation and where we situate ourselves. We also had to think about the composition of our leadership and governance, making sure that it was representative of the country's communities. So in our previous council, we made sure that there were political parties represented from across the ruling and the opposition divide. Our board comprised of 3 founding members, one of whom is currently a prince, the son of a ruler, another from an Islamic party, and I'll talk a bit more about that later because that's been actually the trend. And yet another from UMNO, a ruling Malay nationalist party. The past CEOs have all been Malay Muslim, and in fact, I am the first CEO of this think tank, who's from a minority group. So this actually makes it a bit more challenging whenever I question the status quo. The language that I use has to be carefully crafted. But it was important for us to rise above the divisions between communities and position ourselves clearly as a think tank that identified as Malaysian. We've also had to navigate through and negotiate extremely carefully this treacherous territory of Malaysia's many fault lines, which I believe are shared in many of your countries as well around the world. So even though we believe in things like equality before the law, and it's something that you would assume is accepted across the board today, the reality is that it's actually impossible for us to even utter the words to abolish special rights of the majority population. So what have we had to do? Instead of calling for abolishing ethnic privileges entirely, which would actually render our other policy research and advocacy meaningless because of backlash, we've had to use the language of technocrats, somebody mentioned technocracy earlier, to essentially push for the same outcomes. We want competition. We want a level playing field. We rock the boat, but not rock the boat too much. And it really has taken us experience to know when to push and when not to push. Instead of talking about the flaws of ethnic-based affirmative action policy per se, we pursue research on government-linked companies, which were set up primarily to elevate the economic interests of the Bumiputra. And we show that GLCs are compromised through other means, through corruption, through patronage, through leakages of funds, and that's not good for the majority Bumiputra. We've placed greater emphasis on the policy work around institutional reform, good governance, anti-corruption, transparency, accountability, all of these, I suppose, words that we are familiar with in think tanks, but communities don't necessarily know them, and we use these words rather than the controversial word liberal. So liberal is a dirty word in Malaysia. Liberal connotates, may I say, the assumption that people think about when you say liberal is, free sex and sexuality and so on. But we don't use the word liberal. Instead, we look at the values that underpin the same liberal democracy that we actually do believe in. We also say terms like professionalizing politics. So we push our policymakers and politicians to think along the lines of policy as opposed to identity politics of race and religion. Thus far, I've shared about the positioning strategy that IDEAS has adopted in situating ourselves within the public's mind. And in doing so, we have been able to ride out the storm of what has taken place over the last few years in Malaysia. So in case anyone missed it, we have a former Prime Minister who's in jail. It was the largest case of abuse of corruption that was called out by the Department of Justice in the US. This is Najib Razak. And as a result, over the last 4 years, which coincides with the COVID pandemic, the country experienced the most political instability with 5 prime ministers in 5 years. Remember, before this, we only had one party up to 2018. There's a widening chasm at the moment between the different ethnicities, and this is fueled by suspicion and highly politicized narratives laced with racist remarks, which are both perpetuated and supported by extremist wings of political parties that represent these ethnic communities. Most recently, there's been a case where a Chinese-led supermart, or like a retail mart, was charged because the mart sold, inadvertently, by the way, socks that had the phrase or embroidery of the term Allah on it. And this is considered very, very unacceptable among our Islamic friends, because you use the socks and then you walk on the socks. The unfortunate thing is that the retail mart was actually led by a very Chinese group of gentlemen. They eventually apologized. They apologized to the king. They went to the king to apologize, but still there was a nationwide call for boycott of this retail mart. And this has also set off and sparked off a series of boycott calls for other businesses that are run by the Chinese community. So right now I'm speaking to you at a time where the nerves are very raw. There's a lot of sensitivities out there. So amidst this complex, fluid situation, political change, this sort of polarization that we feel, like it's a visceral thing that I feel on a day-to-day basis, rapidly shifting political allegiances, IDEAS has surprisingly, I'm not sure, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, been able to maintain our independence and relationships with the different governments, primarily due to the positioning strategies I have mentioned. We have been careful, knowing when to speak and when not to, when I need to speak and when I should not. We criticize the policy and not the personality, the substance of the policy and its effects, preferring not to comment on identity politics. So friends, we've heard a lot, I think, in the conference about how think tanks are shifting away from their traditional roles into becoming more engaged in communities. I admit IDEAS is one of those think tanks that is still elite. We engage primarily with elite circles. We target policy advocacy at members of parliament, policymakers, business circle, and mostly concentrated within the urban centers and in the English language. We are not a community organizer or grassroots organization at the outset. But we've also heard a lot about the importance of building networks, partnerships, and coalitions. This has been fundamental to our recent years' impact. As a think tank, we've collaborated and built partnerships with other civil society organizations because they are the ones that have a deeper connection with grassroots. I talked a lot about religion. One example is we work with NGOs that are Islamic in nature. Some of them are highly conservative as well. We had a project, for example, in trying to revisit the government's decision not to ratify ICERD, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Malaysia is one of the few countries that has not signed and ratified it. It's considered controversial because of the perception that the constitutional provision will be amended, the one that I talked about earlier. In some of these meetings, I've had to rely on my staff, my colleagues, who themselves were Malay or Muslim in identity. We don't want to play the game of identity politics, but sometimes out of necessity, I could not even attend some of these important meetings because of who I am. And that's okay. I understood why, and I asked my staff and my colleagues to please attend these meetings, reach out, understand where they're coming from. A lot of time was spent on trust building to assure them that we were not necessarily slamming their positions at the very outset. I think think tanks have a special power. We have a special convening power that other organizations don't necessarily have. Our convening power has allowed us to bring government, politicians of different sides together that otherwise would never meet, not even come to the same table, not even be in the same room. we succeeded to bring members of parliament from different parties to promote political financing reform, which none of their parties actually support, but individually they do. Separately, we've also started working more directly with the community. We set up a network of subnational level activists and NGOs to train them on how to read their state budgets. So I think Liliana this morning was talking about public finance. We do public finance as well, but at the subnational level, that's been really interesting to see how they appreciate content, because they don't get it otherwise. They want to learn from the toolkits that we have to provide with them. We also set up, communities for indigenous education, going into villages to talk to teachers and students about their challenges, hopes, and dreams. Why did we do these? I think all of our think tanks have done so for different reasons. Some for funding purposes. I think we do recognize that we need to increase the demand for accountability from the bottom up. Ultimately, politicians, especially in an electoral system that's first past the post, like in Malaysia, they need to see and believe that there's pressure from their own voters before they decide to act on a certain policy. Otherwise, it's never going to happen. We will also want to show that impact can happen away from the halls of parliament, that a groundswell of support and learning should happen from the bottom up. But in all of these, and this is where we come to the granular details, I think there have been challenges, right? One of the challenges we talked about a lot. Essentially, at the heart, we are researchers. Think tanks are research-oriented. The skill sets of research staff are very different. And we talked about that as well. Very different from what is required to do network building and maintenance. Two is the issue of representation. Can elite think tanks like ours understand the problems and real-life issues that they face? We come in and out. They live these problems on a daily basis. The third is an interesting one, the challenge of divergence of positions within the same coalition. So you may agree with your coalition partners and your network partners on the issue of anti-corruption or governance. You might not agree with your coalition partners on something else, on religion, on economics and free trade, for example. How do you manage those relationships then? Do you still maintain your network partnerships, or do you break apart those partnerships because of other issues that you cannot agree with? In our case, we had instances of coalition members who opposed free trade agreements that we were actually championing. And eventually what we did was to talk it out and say, look, there's a bigger goal here. There's a bigger picture that we want to achieve for political financing reforms. For example, let's agree to disagree. So I'm just throwing some stones here and see whether these are things that you have experienced as well. We also diversified the network, bringing in groups that were stronger in community engagement than we were. We don't necessarily have all the answers. And I think one thing we also did was to speak to politicians as equals rather than coming from an ivory tower. So many times, civil society believes that, or think tanks actually believe that we have the answers. But this time what we did was we asked, what are the problems and challenges that politicians face? And we don't compromise on our ideals, but we look at how the laws and policies can actually accommodate not accommodate is not the right word, but to suit the reality of the situation. So for example, listening to local politicians changed our mind about how high the political financing threshold for transparency should be. In the middle of the pandemic, we also reached out to all think tanks across the spectrum. And in Malaysia, just to point out, we are one of the few independent think tanks. Most others are affiliated to government or a political party or a political individual. So we led a coalition of think tanks to endorse a public statement calling for the government to change the way it managed the pandemic, including calling for more data-driven decision-making, which at the time was not happening. So that's our work on political financing reform, so again, across the divide. And it was because of this relationship building that we actually allowed us to host Enrique over there, for a local OTT talk. And this was with a gathering of think tanks across the political spectrum. So people who disagree with each other on a daily basis, but being able to come to the table and talk about the pandemic, talk about real economic management issues collectively, and to agree that there is a common view across the divide. I have 5 minutes. I'm going to try and speed up. What I really want to say is actually that as the world becomes ever more polarized, which I think the 2 recent wars have really intensified, I really believe that it is so important for think tanks to be the bridge across divided communities. There was a study carried out in 2018. This is already several years ago, and this is, before Ukraine, before Israel-Palestine, so imagine the numbers today, right? 3 out of 4 people across 27 countries think society in their country is divided. Countries that are most concerned about their division are Serbia, Argentina, Peru, and Chile. Yeah, this is just a second graph. So how divisions have changed since 10 years ago. 6 out of 10 feel their country is more divided. Today, Europeans are more likely to think that divisions have grown, and 3/4 of Spanish people say their country is more divided now than a decade ago. I don't think we can have all the answers after today. I mean, we're not going to solve, the wars and the polarization of the world, but think tanks are needed now more than ever. We need to work within and with communities. Working with communities will require different sets of skills, expertise, and stamina than think tanks had traditionally been expected to have. Making use of our strong networks upwards with the elite and downwards with community organizers is really powerful. But there's a but as well. So if we conceptualize this idea of like think tanks plus, so we are not just who we are, but we are who we network with. We are who we partner with. The but is that sustaining networks and partnerships is incredibly exhausting. It requires core funding. I don't know if there are funders here. Core funding and consistent funding. Time is needed to build trust with partners across ethnicities and political persuasions. It's really time. And these relationships go on and on over WhatsApp and email and meetings and so on. You don't see the light at the end of the tunnel so soon. There are also disruptions when network members leave for other jobs. Then you have to start the work all over again. The convening power that think tanks have mean that we are not the activists on the ground. Community-based activists must focus scarce resources on their frontline work. They are unable to organize the type of research-based evaluation and policy messaging that is the core specialization of us, think tanks. We need to partner with the community to consolidate the message, get a policy proposal out. We occupy the important middle ground as we are not identified with the street-based activism, which has its rightful place. We need to open the doors and bring the principles and evidence that support the objectives into the policy-making space. I know I need to end. Last few things. Community engagement also helps to enrich our data collection methods to inform our research. We don't have necessarily all the policy prescriptions, but what we learn informs our work and delivers impact. My final point, what all this means for think tanks is that, unfortunately, where we are today, we are in great demand to be many things to many people. We are in demand to be all things to all people. We need to maintain a high quality of research while also working with the community to establish networks and build partnerships. This is an increasing expectation, and I don't think we're going to go back. Resilience is required for the long haul, but I believe that think tanks must show that we are contributing to the community because we are part of the community. Therefore, the think tank ecosystem needs to change, to adapt. Funders and fellow think tanks must be able to provide the support, encouragement like these conferences, facilitation to ensure these networks survive and thrive. So I'll just end with this. To survive, as a species, I think we have to overcome the illusion that we are separate and realize that we are interdependent, mutually dependent beings. For centuries, communities have thrived precisely because of our ability to work together. And there is an intrinsic desire to connect with each other. To quote Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk and writer, we are all part of one another and all involved in one another. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Tricia. That was a really, really great keynote. I'm so sorry that I had to cut you halfway, but thank you so much. I think that was an excellent case study of how we can look at how do think tanks connect with communities in terms of even the internal representation of think tanks. And secondly, yes, there are funders here. Just so you know, there is a session on funders and there's a box so you can drop your questions. But we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just wondering, we can take maybe 2 quick questions or reflections, and then Tricia, you can respond to them. So is there anybody who would like to share a reflection, a question, maybe you disagree? Everybody seems happy. Is there anybody who could maybe relate to that kind of political context? Oh, well, there's one here, Sonia, and is somebody going from there as well? Yeah. Okay. So we'll do Danny, and then we'll go Sonia.
Very impressive. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering if you can go a little bit more in detail as to how you navigate what you do and what you think you cannot do, how you draw the line, because you're not in a setting where voice and democratic accountability is yet ideal, to put it mildly. And in that decision of where to draw the line, where sometimes taking some risks are necessary or they are avoided.
Thanks so much, Danny. We'll do Sonia, and then Tricia, you can respond. Thanks.
It's also a question about the lines. So what are your red lines? Where do you don't compromise, where you stop?
Okay, thank you. Really great questions. I think for us, 2 very important red lines, which would be we don't comment on sexuality, rights, and we don't comment on anything to do with the rulers and the king. So I know this is recorded as well and will be put up. So I won't comment on the 2 things that I won't comment on. If that makes sense. But I think, yeah, there are red lines, so we know what those lines are that we just simply cannot cross. If we go there, it makes completely rubbish all the rest of our work. So we don't want to do that. I think I talked about it in my speech, where we use, the language of technocracy. We say good governance, institutional reforms, but actually all those things still point in the same direction of questioning inequality. Why is there, institutionalized inequality? So these things point in that direction, but we may not necessarily say explicitly that this is addressing the elephant in the room. Sometimes we talk about different parts of the elephant, but if you name the elephant, then it's much easier for you to be taken down and discredited. So again, I think a lot of the conference we've talked about credibility. It's so important. All the work that we do can really just be toppled over by one comment that one person says on social media. So how we carry ourselves, it's stressful, but unfortunately that's just the reality. People are out to look for mistakes. I think that's the environment that we're operating in today, and it's scary. It's scary for many numbers of reasons. I mean, even for you think tanks who don't operate in difficult and challenging conditions, I think there's another challenge, which is, what's happening on Twitter, where I believe the liberals are eating each other up. So the liberals are eating liberals, and you're trying to find who can be more liberal than the other. So that's the extreme end of the spectrum, right? So on our spectrum, we have the conservative challenge. On the other spectrum, you have the liberal challenge. And I think on both ends, they're actually meeting at some point to stifle freedom of speech. Yeah.
Thank you again so much, Tricia. Unfortunately, we don't have much time, but do continue the conversation outside. But thank you so much again, Tricia. Yes, thank you.